Hello, this is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Today we're going to talk about genocides, holocausts, and extremist movements that are going on in the United States today. I'm here today with Professor Bjorn Krondorfer, who is a professor as well as a director at Northern Arizona University. He teaches at the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies, and he currently chairs the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. We're going to talk about his new book called Unsettling Empathy. Professor Bjorn has done a great job of studying how you resolve conflicts, specifically in genocide. So he spent a lot of his work doing studies on how do you resolve conflicts of people who were born in Germany and, for that matter, Jewish people who are concerned about what happened during the Holocaust. He's also done work with Native Americans as well as individuals inside of Israel. But the real key to this is figuring out what it is that we actually can do to resolve the differences that exist between us. And in the United States, as those differences on the far right and the far left are making this country more divisive, it's one of those things that we need to spend some time thinking about and talking about as we move forward in any type of political reform, or for that matter, how it is that we act as individuals. Again, I think you'll enjoy the show today. Welcome to the Optimistic American. Now we're on with Professor Bjorn. Professor Krondorfer, I'd like to welcome you to the Optimistic American, and thanks for coming on our show today.
Thank you.
All right, so you have spent, you're a professor, you spent an awful lot of time on genocides, holocausts, you spent a significant amount of time on conflict resolution and actually written a couple of books on those. But what I'd like to start with, before we actually get into the details of how you try to resolve conflicts between groups and thinking about the big issues that were affected by oftentimes groups who are on either side of these conflicts. What led you to this? What was it that made you interested in this subject in the first place?
That is a wonderful opening question, and not an easy one to answer, because I didn't set out to study these intense conflicts, these traumatic legacies, when I began my studies first in theology and then later in comparative religious studies, which I started in Germany first and then pursued at Temple University in Philadelphia. So my background is comparative religious studies, but I also quickly learned that both in religion, but also with my own background in being born in Germany, that there are unresolved issues in history that prevent you from thinking clearly about both the past and also how to move forward in the present towards a better future. And eventually, through conversations in the United States with the Jewish survivor community from the Holocaust, the descendants of Jewish survivors, I realized how much, as a person born in Germany after the Holocaust, I had to wrestle with the demons of my society. And that personal encounter with an unresolved lethal legacy led me to other conflicts and to think about other conflicts and to genocide studies and Holocaust studies, and eventually to the position I'm in right now at Northern Arizona University, where I'm the director of a center that has a public mandate for education that was founded by a Polish Jewish survivor from the Holocaust. And so somehow it came full circle. And that's where I am right now. And we do programming that reaches students and the community alike to really help them think through these difficult legacies and what we need to do today. We can't get stuck in the past. We need to move forward. And unfortunately, the present time is not an optimistic time. We see too many problems worldwide.
All right, so you have written an awful lot on this. I've read it quite a bit, but you wrote a book called Unsettling Empathy. What I'd like you to do is maybe describe what that book was about, and maybe even more importantly than the description, to what end? Why were you writing that book?
The title indeed is Unsettling Empathy. And the first question that I'm asked is, so do you want to deconstruct empathy? Do you want to unsettle empathy? Or do I want an empathy that is unsettling us? And it's the latter that I'm interested in, to work with an empathy that unsettles our assumptions about ourselves, about history, about what we think, about the person with whom we think we are in conflict or with whom we are actually in conflict. That's a kind of title that I chose for this book, to think about groups in past conflicts and groups in current conflicts, and how we can move forward without being stuck in the old ideological frameworks that have divided us or still divide us. And what I realized over almost 20 to 30 years of working in this field, that this phrase unsettling empathy is what we need. That is to say, we need to meet, listen to each other, but not just listen to each other, but also engage with each other in as much honesty as we're willing to have, or as much courage we have to be honest with each other. And that unsettles our own assumptions. And that is the moment where some transformation happens, where we actually listen and understand what the other group, the other community, the other person is telling us, that we may not like, but that it's important for us to fully understand.
Yeah, it's interesting. In our studies, Dr. Basha and I, as we've looked at how ideologies begin to have an effect on people, one of the things that we found is that the deeper someone gets involved in ideology, the more difficult it is to actually have a conversation with them. And if you try to have a conversation with them that unsettles them, especially someone who's dug into the extreme versions of it, it actually can have a violent reaction. So
You're
part
absolutely
of
right.
so
You're absolutely right.
so
Yeah.
part of what you have to do is you have to find a way to have a conversation with them that actually looks empathetic, that looks like you're genuinely interested in them, and that maybe isn't even pushing them on the issue. But what I'd like to do is, so you've been an American most of your life, but you were born in Germany, and you said that there are different narratives. I'd like to know, especially, I know one of the first trips that you did that began kind of your journey on this, you brought together some Jewish, I believe they were Americans, Jewish Americans, as well as Germans, who had this experience where they went back and looked at the Holocaust sites and did a wide variety of work on what had taken place. But you said that there are different narratives. How do you think the German narrative differs from the Jewish narrative about what happened in the Holocaust?
Well, the power of narratives, which is similar to the power of ideology, we take our own narratives to be the truth, just as people take certain ideological frameworks as the truth, and that makes them so powerful and potentially also dangerous. So the power of narratives and ideology is that we think we understand ourselves in a particular framework of how the world functions. And for the German students that I met and brought them together with Jewish American students, these were university students, starting in 1989. That's quite a time ago. So the narratives also shifted between then and now. But the narrative for Germans at the time was that it was clearly understood the Holocaust was an awful, unforgivable event, but they didn't see themselves or their families implicated in that history, meaning their grandparents or parents. And that was incomprehensible for the Jewish American students. They had a very hard time to understand why their German counterparts, whom they actually liked, did not investigate their own family histories. So when they were asked, what did your parents do or your grandparents do, there was often just a blank stare and some kind of narrative that basically came down to saying like they didn't do much or weren't involved, or telling a story that seemed a little unlikely. And I can give you an example in a moment if you want to.
I do.
And for the German students, it was hard to suddenly feeling almost accused by their counterparts, same age group, by their Jewish American counterparts, because they felt like, here we are willing to engage. Why are you pointing the finger at us? So there was immediately a sense of confrontation based on the expectations that each group brought to the other.
All right, tell me that story.
So, for example, I remember one of the stories where a young German, meaning in their 20s, in the I think was in the program they did in the 1990s, basically said, I know from my family that they were safekeeping some of the furniture and I don't know what else, furniture and other things from a Jewish neighbor. Because a Jewish neighbor was deported, and my grandparents um, helped themselves with the stuff that was left in the apartment because they wanted to keep it for the time when their neighbors will return. Now, it's possible. It's possible. But for our Jewish students, the story sounded very differently. It sounded like, oh, no, they enriched themselves. They basically stole it, enriched themselves. And then maybe in the 1960s, 1970s, they came up with the story that this was for safekeeping in case the Jewish neighbors come back, turn a story of plunder, or possibly a story of plunder, into something that sounds good, as if you're rescuing something for the Jewish neighbors that, of course, they at some point understood would never come back. So that's what I mean by different stories and different narratives. And the question was, would the young German generation believe what their parents and grandparents are telling them? Or is it important for them to have a moment of skepticism and begin questioning whether these narratives are really true, whether their own families are really as innocent as they portray themselves? And this is tough because you have to question your own background, and you don't want to question your own family. You don't want to be suspicious of it, but certainly in former perpetrator societies, the next generation has to be suspicious of the narratives that are being passed on to the next generation.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think it's even more fascinating to think about this whole concept I think that Hitler tried to implement, which was Lebensraum, the idea that they needed living room, living space. And of course, that was a justified process of taking other people's property, taking things from other people, and to make it and to apply a legal reason for why it was justified and okay.
There are definitely two ideologies coming together, several ideologies, but the two that I'm thinking of right now in Nazi ideology. One is the Lebensraum space, the living, wanting more living space, thinking that Eastern Europe is like vast land with few people, and they wanted to pretty much more or less enslave the Slavic population. That was one. A spatial ideology. The other one was a racial or racist ideology that certain populations were not welcome and were dispensable and were dangerous and a lethal threat to the German idea of Aryan purity, and they had to be killed. So they have both of these things. And unfortunately, the kind of racialized ethnic hatred is one form of ideology. The other one is actual geographic space. And we see this over and over again in the justifications for genocidal violence.
We've interviewed lots of survivors of genocides, and I always find it interesting because people who survived the actual Holocaust, they thought that the problem, the reason that people were this way was because they were Germans. But if you went to Bosnia, they thought that people were this way because they were Christians, because they were Muslims being persecuted. Emily's family, who was in Iraq, they thought that it was because of Arabs, right? If you went to Rwanda, it was the Tutsis thinking it was because they were Hutus. But the thing that seems clear to me is all of us are susceptible to being on either sides of these issues. All of us are. And what ideology does is it allows us to, all of us have good and evil inside of us. We all have the propensity to be able to be good or to be evil. But ideology allows us to release that evil that's inside of us and to place it on another group. We're doing this to them because they're evil. Alexander Solzhenitsyn talked about moving the kulaks out into Siberia. He said 10,000 families, 60,000 people was his job, and they all died. He said, and the reason that he could do that was because he had been told he was a communist, these were property owners, and that it was justified. There are lots of reasons to justify to do bad things to people. But what I'm really interested in your studies is this idea of, I think you called it the is it the chosen narrative? Is that what it was called? Or chosen trauma. That's what it
Chosen
was.
trauma.
Right. So talk about that concept a little bit, because I think that's fascinating to think about what we do, what all of us do looking backwards.
Let me just briefly come back to another point you raised earlier, and then I will talk about chosen trauma and the fact that we think that we are innocent and our enemies are guilty. The easiest way to justify violence and to make violence operational, that is to get large groups of people who under different circumstances might be nonviolent to commit violence against others, is to frame it as defensive violence, because it's the other group that is attacking us and we need to defend ourselves. Even in the very unequal power relationship between European Jews and Nazi Germany, highly militarized at the time, Nazi Germany framed it as a battle over life and death, because Jews were seen as such a lethal threat that the only way to defend yourself against it is to commit violence against the Jewish population. And it's that defensive moment that makes your violence seemingly good or justifiable. That's where ideology becomes so important and so dangerous.
So we'll come back to this other question I asked you, because I'm going to play on that. In Rwanda, it was always fascinating to me that 96% of the population was Hutu. Only 4%, or excuse me, 96% were Hutus, and only 4% were Tutsis. But what was fascinating was that the Hutus actually were being trained in schools. Their right-wing radio was telling them on a constant basis, their leaders were telling them that they had been oppressed and suppressed by the Tutsis, and that it was all based upon a race issue. But it was the same concept, right? It was, even though they were the majority, there was a belief that they were in a violent struggle with the Tutsis, and the only way for them to win was through some type of violent retribution. What I then find to be interesting is that you go there and you'll find these mass graves where tens of thousands of people were buried, or where churches where people were huddled into churches where they closed the doors and then lit them on fire. And but it was clear that this wasn't like 10 people who were out imposing these terrible atrocities on people. It was millions of Hutus implementing atrocities on millions of Tutsis. That they were able to engage the public in this type of oppressed versus oppressor thinking.
Right. Yeah. Same with, when Hitler came to power in 1933, the Jewish population that were German citizens was minimal. I forget the exact number, but less than 3% of the total population. I think even less than that. And so you have to have a strong ideological propaganda to turn this small group of people into lethal enemies to Germany that might threaten the survival of the German nation. It's not rational, clearly, these things. It is the power of ideological propaganda that gets people there. And of course, those who believe in this ideology, they think it's reality. That's what makes it so hard to puncture their sense of reality, because they really think ideological propaganda is real, and therefore it works.
Well, we're going to come back to that. I think that's a really important issue. Again, now let's talk about chosen trauma. Again, that subject, that topic. What does that mean?
Chosen trauma. It's a term that a psychoanalyst who works with groups in conflict came up with. His name is Vamik Volkan. And by that, he means that communities and nations create a narrative about an injustice that they perceived was perpetrated against them, that came with some suffering, and turn this into a narrative where it becomes the one accepted national narrative of a traumatized people, of their own traumatized people, of the people of our people, so to speak, if it's a particular nation, where they were treated unjustly, and you turn this into a narrative that becomes a national narrative that determines all the individual stories that people tell about themselves in the future. So the, for example, the and chosen trauma. People always think like people choose their trauma. Of course, no one chooses any traumatic violence against oneself. It's not a choice in that sense. But what it means is like we choose the way how we narrate a particular traumatic event of injustice that happened to our group, and to give an example, the chosen trauma for the Palestinian people would be what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the expulsion from the land in 1948 and before, when Israel became its own independent state. Chosen trauma doesn't mean it didn't happen. Of course it happened. But there were other events in the Palestinian history that later, 20 years later, that were equally devastating for the Palestinian people, but they don't rise to this one moment where the Palestinian people see like this is the moment where that tells the story of our suffering, and that's the Nakba. It's not what happened in 1967 or even after different periods, and the same could be said about other people. For example, go back to Germany. The German people, the chosen trauma of the German people after 1945 is the years 1944 to 1946. Now, for those who don't know German history, it sounds strange because you think like the Germans were the perpetrators of World War II and the Holocaust, but the traumatic stories that are being told in Germany is when Germany itself was attacked by, was losing the war, and the cities were attacked by British American bombing raids and the Soviet Union who invaded from the east. And so the stories that were being told in families for a long, long time were the stories between 44 and 46, when Germany and German people suffered the results of the war that they had unleashed in 1939. And so what it helped Germans to do is to neglect the years 1939 to 1944 that led to the defeat of Germany and the suffering that German people experienced. So the chosen trauma narrative suddenly becomes, the moment that Germans suffered. And it functions well, and it's not that it's not true. Germans did suffer at the end, but what it conveniently leaves out the reasons of why we got to this point in 1944 to begin with. So for a long time, the German narrative about World War II in German families started towards the end of the war and was always war stories, but nothing ever about what we call the Holocaust now. Like hardly ever did German families even mention that they knew a Jewish neighbor or mention Jewish people or mention that they knew anything about Jews or any of the other people that were persecuted, and in many cases killed by Nazi Germany. So the chosen narrative focuses on one part of history and turns this into something that you can tell as your story of suffering.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think you can find that over and over again. On the South, on the issue of the Civil War and slavery, no
Yes.
doubt the chosen narrative of African Americans is slavery, justifiably. But if you go to the South, you can still find many white families who talk about Sherman's raids and how traumatic that was for their grandparents and what happened in terms of people who starved to death because of the raids that had taken place. And again, you're right. It doesn't mean that those raids weren't brutal. It was, as part of war, it was brutal, but maybe even further than that. But it's also a way to escape the other narrative about, well, why were we in this war in the first place? Why was it
Right.
taking place?
It shapes our collective community or collective narratives, and every personal narrative gets framed within that larger collective narrative, and then often prevents us from looking at narratives that might contradict this larger framework, which we call the chosen trauma narrative that was created.
So where would you see a chosen narrative as being helpful, and where is it harmful in terms of a society?
It's helpful insofar as it frames our experience, and it may bring into speech complicated issues where people suffered and often suffered in shameful circumstances. And shame is one of the things that shame is often beyond language. And framing it in a particular narrative helps us to verbalize shameful events that we experienced, either because shameful because we were culpable or shameful because we were at the other end, namely the victim of humiliation and transgressions and violence. The danger is that it prevents us from seeing legitimacy of the narrative of the people with whom we are in conflict or have been in conflict. So it remains self-centered in a certain way, self-centered as a nation or as a community in a certain way, and prevents us from giving legitimacy to the narrative of other people. And that's a danger.
So when you brought these two groups together, um, did you find success? Did you find that they were able to reach some common ground? And if you did, what was the process to get there?
I assume referring to the book Unsettling Empathy,
Yes.
where I kind of tell stories of how people responded to moderated encounters where we met for 4 to 5 to 6 days, sometimes even longer. And whatever groups we had, they would come and sit together and we would work through the narratives, through improvisation, to try to understand each other in different ways and give voice to our own uncertainties and a willingness to listen to other people's uncertainties. It's to put it short, it's really hard work because people want to stick with their narrative, with their assumption about how the world functions and about their own sense of being the victim of history rather than maybe being culpable in other ways against other people. And when it comes to Israelis and Palestinians, the two groups I worked with a lot, it's very easy for each side to fall into a long list of justifiable complaints about the other group. But if you just get stuck in listing all the injustices that have been done to you, you don't get to understand of how what you did to another group have affected this group and led to mistrust. That you even mistrust the fact that the way how people tell the stories, you don't even fully you don't allow yourself to fully understand that the violence that another group experienced is valid and valuable and not exaggerated, and to get to the point that you can actually let go of your defensive mechanism and fully understand that, yes, something that our group did to you was devastating and traumatic, and I fully understand now. Doesn't mean I it doesn't mean much more than that for the moment. And for the other group to see like, oh, someone recognizes fully my experience. Not to justify anything or to defend anything, but just to understand. That usually is a moment when more honest, open conversation can happen between groups. This is not policy making. This is not on the level of politicians coming together to figure out a policy of something. This is communities coming together to see whether they can live with each other in the near future.
And when you did break it down, when you were successful, what did you see as being the magic steps that led to that?
That's a good question. I wish I would have magic, but I don't. I give you an example, if that's okay.
Perfect.
When we met in Israel, and sometimes we meet in Israel or the West Bank, depending on the situation, with a group of Israelis and Palestinians, and sometimes we add German participants in these groups. There was a tense moment after a Palestinian participant invited some of the Israelis to come down with him to Bethlehem in the evening. And Bethlehem is on the other side of the West Bank, divided by a big wall, the separation wall. And some of the Israelis said, yes, I'm happy to go with you. And he took them in his own car. And apparently he made many phone calls in the car and was speaking Arabic to his friends because he wanted his friends to meet them. And they all met and had a nice night out. The next morning, when we met back in the group and to continuing the processing of what we experienced and who we are, one of the Israeli women who was part of this group said, if I'm really honest, because we got to the level of honesty, if I'm really honest, and she turned to the Palestinian young man, said, when you turned Arabic on the phone while we were driving down to Bethlehem, I was afraid you're arranging a kidnapping of us, which is obviously the complete opposite of what this young Palestinian man wanted to do. But that's the fear that we have of the other. And it was incredibly courageous of this woman to say that, because she knew the moment she would say it, she will be in trouble, or
Mm-hmm.
she thought she will be in trouble. Because basically it's saying, like, I'm not trusting you. We've been together for 5 days, but I'm still not trusting you. And this Palestinian young man's response was to, for the first time, completely relax and be fully present, because he wasn't before. And he said, I'm so glad you're saying it, because we suspected your fears all along. And finally, someone has the courage to say it in our face, because we know this anyway. And that opened a whole new relationship between these two, but also for our group. That kind of honesty to share in the face of the other the fear that you have, rational or irrational, whatever it is, and for the other person to give the other person a chance to respond.
That's fascinating.
This was one of these transformative moments, what I call unsettling empathy.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you've done this with students in Germany. You've done this with students in Israel. And I guess here's what I'm interested in. In Germany, we're 4 or 5 generations back from the problem. In Israel, the problem is ongoing. When you're trying to resolve conflicts in those two different situations, how do you find it as being? How is it different, and where do you find greater success, when you're farther away from the problem or when you're in the middle of it? And maybe try to explain what
It's
differences you
it's
saw.
it's easier if a conflict has been principally resolved and we are now living in the aftermath of the consequences of a genocidal conflict, as in the case of the Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust itself ended. The repercussions of this event didn't end. I mean, second, third generations, we are still dealing with that event, but the event itself ended. There's no danger at this point that the Holocaust will continue, maybe in forms of anti-Semitism, but that's a slightly different topic. So it's a little easier to find willingness to address the past and the narratives and the stories being told about the past if you're not living in immediate danger or in immediate fear. It makes it easier. And it's easier to also address the chosen traumas, because you can look back and see how the narrative changed over the time for each decade. If you're in an ongoing conflict, it is much harder to first be critical about your own narrative, your own understanding of the world, and be open to trusting the other side, because the danger is still there and the danger is still real. And the danger, say, in the Israeli Palestinian conflict, is not that anyone says all Israelis are bad or all Palestinians are bad, but the fear is like, I don't know who I can trust and who I cannot trust if I encounter someone of your community. And that makes it much harder than to address in openness and honesty the ambiguities of feelings we have about each other.
Yes. All right. So,
But I can give you a counterexample.
okay, give me the counterexample.
Sometimes the past can be revised and revived in ways that something that seemed like 600 years ago suddenly becomes a potent ideological lethal force again. And now I'm thinking about the conflict between Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and you probably know about this.
Yes.
When suddenly the Serbian Prince Lazar from 1389 was kind of revived in the Serbian national narrative, as the one person who almost Christ-like tried to save the Serbian people from the Turkish invasion. But 600 years ago, it's like, okay, interesting historical phenomenon, however you want to interpret it, but it was used to revive anxiety and fear against the Muslim population in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And all Muslims in Bosnia suddenly were the old Turks from the 14th century, Turkish Muslims who wanted to destroy Serbian national identity. So suddenly a very old, long gone history can be revived in ideological terms to bring back, to recreate old hatreds.
Yeah. So, I spent a lot of time in politics. We spent a lot of time looking at genocides. My partner works with doing evaluations of terrorists, people involved in capital crimes in prisons. And then I've also spent a lot of time on political extremism. I can tell you there's a formula if you want to try to move a block of people. And the formula is you terrify them. Right? This concept of the amygdala hijack, what it really is that inside of each of our brains, there's this more primitive portion of the brain, the amygdala. And if you can terrify it, it moves into the fight, flight, or freeze mode. But more importantly, it overshadows, it captures the neocortex where rationality, optimism, love, innovation, creativity, where all those human characteristics exist. And once you overpower that, you just simply can't get the human mind to think rationally. So if you were a cynic and you said, hey, I want to go create a television station or a news station or a radio station, you would be much smarter not to give objective news. That would be the last thing that you would want to do. All right, what you would want to do is terrify people. And it's harder to terrify all people at the same time because different people are terrified by different things. What you would do is you'd pick a partisan approach, right? You'd either pick the right or the left, and you would go after the fears that group had of the other side. Now, that can be religious, that can be geographical, that can be based upon race, that can be based upon a lot of different things. But once you know who your group is, if you can terrify them, that amygdala jumps in and people begin making decisions emotionally. Now, I've met lots of pollsters in politics. I've worked on a number of presidential campaigns, people who are exceptional at knowing how to move the public. And candidly, their thought kind of goes like this. You have to motivate your base. Here's how you motivate your base. Terrify them. Terrify them about the other side.
In my work, in my facilitation work with groups in conflict, I've seen it on this micro level, how that functions. Once fear sets in, it's just contagious. Mm-hmm. And it works so well. It works way better than saying, I promise you a great future. It doesn't work as well as saying, like, you should be afraid right now about these people or this thing, whatever. And there were situations where there was no reason for fear, and suddenly someone brought fear into our conversation, and I felt it. It's like, it's not rational, but I suddenly like, oh, maybe we are under threat. Maybe someone could disrupt our group meetings with guns and take us hostage. And it's very hard to protect yourself from, once fear sets in, it's hard to protect yourself from it. And you're absolutely right. That's how we see it in this country, in the United States right now, that the politics of fear mobilizes people way more than the politics of optimism.
Yeah, it's so, I've tried to have conversations with a number of people who are trying to solve the problem. And one of the thoughts is how we're going to solve the problem is we have to give them good information and credible sources. Once people are afraid, that won't work, right? The facts don't matter. So it's why we get so frustrated when we'll hear people, they talk about alternative facts, they talk about conspiracy theories, all those types of things. Once people are afraid, then they start looking for the logic to cling to that justifies that fear. The only thing that works is human connection. What you're doing in those, you said that this is about communities, not politicians. If you asked me, politicians ought to be doing the same thing, because you can't beat this just by having a better rational argument. You beat this by building human connections. When we label someone, if I were Jewish and I didn't like you because you were German, and I said, well, he's a Nazi, right? And I made that comment. What I'm really doing is I'm creating a justification in my mind to treat you poorly. Right? I'm creating a justification in my mind for why I've been harmed and why you have been the oppressor. You have been the aggressor. And once I can get to the point of objectifying you, I can get people to do the same thing to you that many of the Nazis did to Jews, right? It's just not that hard of a leap. So if I'm going to fix it, how do you fix it? More communication? Probably not, because if your communication's already broken down into fear, it's not going to work. What does work is seeing people as people, not seeing them as part of a group. And you almost can't do that in the abstract. You have to do that in person. You have to do that by getting to know other people. I love the work that you're doing. I think it's incredibly important, but I think it's important way beyond just helping groups at that social level. All right, so I want to go to another concept, and I don't remember the quote exactly, but I loved it at the beginning of your book. And it was something along the line of forgiving the unforgivable. Can you talk about that for me?
Well, it's an ethical, philosophical conundrum that ethicists have kind of given us, and that is, if you talk about forgiveness, we talk about something that demands something that happened that demands a kind of forgiveness. But the question is, if we forgive something, is it something that we actually wasn't as bad and traumatic, and therefore it's easy for us to simply say it's okay. I don't take it personally. I forgive you. I let you go. But what about the deeds and crimes, the criminal crimes, or the kind of violence that seems really unforgivable? Like someone murdered my child, or a nation murdered a whole group, like Nazi Germany murdered Jews, or in Cambodia you murdered your own people for an ideology. So these kind of seemingly unforgivable crimes. But if it's truly unforgivable, how can it be forgiven? And the people who argue for true forgiveness is like the test case is, are we able to forgive something that on first sight looks like unforgivable? And it's a paradox, and it cannot be easily solved. And in my own work, I mention it in my book as thinking through these issues, but actually in my own work, forgiveness does not take center stage. And the reason why I'm saying this is often people think forgiveness is a one-time act rather than a process. Like you do it and then things should be fine, or at least you've done your part, and that's that. So I talked about, or suggesting that we should talk about reconciliatory practices. And the benefit of that term is to say, like, it's a commitment to find ways to acknowledge the other person, the other community, the other nation, and to commit to a process of finding ways to trust each other. At the core of reconciliation is regaining trust of the other person. And it's just a commitment to a path without a sure outcome, without knowing or even assuming what the outcome might be. That it's not so much goal-oriented as just a commitment to walking a path, rather than thinking it's a one-time act and then we are fine. That's why I like the idea of a path much better than forgiveness as a one-time act, or possibly a one-time act, and then we think it's fine. Sometimes it happens, in most times that does not happen anyway, but a commitment to walking together a path that is not determined by whatever pain and harm and injustice happened in the past. Not neglecting this and not forgetting it, but not having this determine where we want to go together.
Yeah, and it's there are psychological reasons why we want to hang on to our anger and our hatred. There are psychological justifications for doing that. One of my a guy who I fought a lot with during the time I was mayor was the senator from Arizona. You teach in northern Arizona, but his name
I
was
do.
John
Yeah.
McCain. Senator McCain and I fought incessantly while I was mayor. And I remember one day after he had left running for president the first time, and after I was gone as mayor, he walked by me and we both kind of gave one another a bad look. And then he turned back around and came over and he says, "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" I said, "Sure." He says, "Hey, I want you to know that I treated you really bad when you were mayor." And he says, "I did that because," he says, "I learned in a prisoner of war camp how to hate. And I
Mm,
really hated my enemies." And he said, "I just want you to know that I didn't treat you right and I'm sorry." I couldn't even talk. I mean, I just sat there and kind of looked at him. I felt so bad. I called him the next day and said, "Hey, I really appreciated you saying that." And we started to become friends. But he told me the story over time about how he forgave his enemies in Vietnam. The people who put him in a small 5 by 5 foot cell, who broke his arms, who tortured him, who tortured other people that he knew. And he hated them justifiably. He hated
mm,
them justifiably for what they had done to him. But he said sometimes you forgive not for them but for yourself, so
right.
you can move on, so you can let go. And to me that is the powerful story of forgiveness. Now I also like one of my favorite heroes is Martin Luther King. I think he could be a lesson today, not only to the alt right but to the woke left. He's, this his concepts I think were so solid. But the Greeks like to talk about love in terms of there were 7 different types of loves. He divided it up into 3. There was romantic love, and then there was philia, which was the brotherly love. But he talked about this concept of agape, which was
Hmm.
loving people you don't even know, loving people
Hmm.
who've done harmful things to you. Well, when you think about what he knew was that there were many people in the South who hated blacks,
Mm,
who would shout epithets at blacks, who would harm or commit violence against them. And he also knew that if they returned it in kind first, the public wouldn't know who was right and who was wrong. It would look like it was just this conflict between these two groups who were both doing bad things. By not returning that, it became very clear who was right and who was wrong. But more importantly, he said that there was no defense to love. The idea that you open up a response to other people by forgiving them, it gives them and you a chance to find reconciliation. And while we may actually want to hang on to our anger, I think most of us hope that our children don't. Most of us hope that our kids can go beyond this and that they can live a decent life and that they don't have to live within it. But that, again, that whole concept of forgiving the unforgivable, it's easy to forgive someone for calling you a bad name. It's a lot harder to forgive someone for even their great great grandparents being involved in a genocide that did harm to your grandparents and took things from you and stole from you. It's much harder for you to be forgiving in that instance, but it's probably even more important.
there, yes, there are so many things I could say to this. Just a few. Forgiveness certainly has a healing impact on the person who is forgiving. Just as you mentioned with John McCain, it makes you move forward. It doesn't. You're not stuck in a hatred that doesn't do anyone good and suffocates yourself. And so forgiveness certainly has a positive impact on the person who is forgiving, independent, because you also take back, as we call it, your own agency, your own moral agency. You're no longer dependent on what the other person thinks about you or what the other person did to you. So it has can have a liberating effect. The negative part is you could easily let the perpetrator off the hook. I'm forgiving you. Is like, well, what if the perpetrator still has the old hatred and is willing to torture you again or kill you again? Like, is it dependent? Is forgiveness dependent on the perpetrator having reckoned with his or her own sins or sinful behavior? And there's certainly some concepts that say, like, forgiveness means nothing unless the perpetrator of a particular crime or misdeed recognizes that they did something wrong. Only then can forgiveness be granted. So anyway, you see the complications, but
Mhm.
John McCain was also an exceptional man. Doesn't mean I would necessarily agree with all of his policies or politics, but because of his experience of being so severely victimized and tortured, I think he had a deep understanding of these moral concepts and how they help us as human beings.
You know, what also happened, and this was just my personal experience. Um, again, I didn't like him. I was angry with him. I felt like he had done things to me that he shouldn't have done to me,
Mm,
that just weren't
mm,
right. And I probably overlooked some of the things that I did to him. I just,
mm.
what was it that we were talking about again? The chosen trauma. I had my chosen trauma, right?
True.
But the,
On the personal level.
but the, uh, but once he forgave me and I forgave him, oh my gosh, did he have great gifts to give? Just his
Mm,
story and understanding what had happened to him in his life and his way of looking at things. He changed my mind on some things, and I think I
mm,
changed his mind on a couple as well.
mm,
And we found areas we could work together. We
mm,
began to work on political reforms that we thought were both important to try to get the right and the left from shooting at one another, from being at one another's throats. The point I'm giving is that oftentimes when we decide to utilize hatred instead, we lose the gifts that people who don't think exactly like us have, that we can't get otherwise without having them being a part of who we are. There's huge benefits that come from that process of reconciliation. And it's, unfortunately, I think that we feel like it's selfish to hang on to the anger and the hatred, but it's really,
mm.
you really gain more of a selfish benefit from letting go.
Right. And what you just mentioned and shared with us about your personal experience, in my vocabulary, that's a moment of unsettling empathy, that you suddenly see the person differently. Something was unsettled in your own perception of this person. It opens it up.
I like that.
People always think like if you empathize with someone else, therefore you have to adopt all what the other person is thinking or doing or how they construct the world, and that is not true. You can still hold on to the differences between you, but you don't demonize the other person. You understand where they come from. You don't necessarily agree, but you have enough of an open heart to see where they come from, and the disagreements are not filled with either hatred or anger or fear that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, so I'm going to apply one last thing, and I'd love to just have your input into this because, again, this is what we spend a lot of our time on. When I read through your book and looked at your work, I applied it to the current day extremism. And I know that
Mm,
you've done a lot of work with Native Americans, with people from Israel and the conflict that exists between Israel and Palestinians, as well as the Holocaust with Germans and Jews. To me, it seems like in the United States, we have these, we have, for the most part, we have Republicans and Democrats, which, by the way, aren't all that different from one another. They all believe in an individualistic society and they like our country and they want to make certain that our country works. But both parties have an extreme element that is within them. On the right, they call themselves the alt-right. They're Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and others. And you can find that extending out when we talk about the Trump group. I like to think about like who were his supporters in the MAGA society. In the MAGA society, one of the fascinating things to me is that over half of his supporters, there's a wide variety of different people that supported him, but over half of his supporters were people who were over the age of 50, and they were white males, and they had less than $1,000 in their bank account, right? That group's taking a lot of blame for what's going on in America today, right? But they have a huge distrust of the left. Then you go to the far left, the woke left. There's a sense that it's the patriarchy, that there's a white privilege that everyone who's white has. There's a sense of there being an oppressed and an oppressor, and that is now systematic, that it's capitalism and it's our institutions, and that there's no way around it. And again, I want to stress, I think both of these two groups represent a minority of America. They are the extremes in America. Most people that I know, I have Republican friends, Democratic friends, I'm an independent. I find people can work together just fine in lots of different environments. And even if you get them talking about politics, they can often find common ground. But these two groups on either end, they're shouting at one another just as loud as they possibly can. And there are a whole bunch of people who are somewhere in the middle saying, hey, we just kind of want to move on with life. But yet we have a difficult time getting them to try to reconcile, to talk, to be able to listen to one another. I'd love to know just your thoughts and how that might be reflected in the work that you've done in terms of what's going on in the divisions in America today.
You're asking the most difficult question. Just as, when someone asked the other day, whatever work I did in other conflict situations, might this apply to Russia and Ukraine today? And my answer says, if you're in the middle of an armed conflict, it's not going to work. It's just not happening. Maybe it would happen if you bring together American Ukrainians and American Russians who trace their lineage back to Russia or Ukraine, and they have slightly different opinions on what is happening. This might be a group that you can bring together to figure out, like, what are our common grounds? Where do we differ? What can we do? Can we offer something to both sides in this conflict? But once you're in the war, you have to wait. I mean, there's nothing you can do. And it feels a little bit similar, even though we are not in a war situation in the United States, but it feels a little bit similar right now in the United States. Like, it seems impossible to bring the two sides in the middle together to kind of agree on issues. And what are the reasons? There are some books and some authors who are thinking really we are misnaming the problem, and the much larger problem is that it's kind of a war against the poor that's in this country. Like, the poor are so disenfranchised with no chance to get out of their poverty that this is a real issue. And some of the ideological debates we're having kind of missing out on the fact that we have this huge underclass of people who really don't know how to make it from one day to the next, and how to prevent themselves from going into homelessness, into shelters, and losing everything they have. And of course, if you have that kind of society, if you go back to fear, that's a real economic fear that can be manipulated into different kinds of ideological fears. And how we easily get out of this, I don't know. I mean, that's what we're struggling with. And I'm glad you're having these conversations, because we all need to put our heads together to figure this one out. We certainly can't start with say, the extreme sides. They're not going to come to the table together right now. It can only happen if we strengthen the middle and give them a stronger voice in this, and a stronger political voice. We always think of, as much as I don't like the Italian political system, and they have 12 different parties, or same in Israel, and you have to continuously figure out how to make a viable government. The two-party system is also not working, because it seems to say there are only 2 points of views. If we would have 3 or 4 or 5 parties in the United States, I think it would actually help us because then you can vote for a particular party, and then they have to have coalition talks between 2 different parties and come to some consensus, rather than to assume there are only 2 points of view in this country, and you have to choose between 2 political parties. That already sets you up in a way that becomes confrontational, as we see it right now. And it's sad, because I'm just thinking of the 2 white men, one 84, the other 65, who shot people who they thought are danger, like the young black man who mistakenly went to the wrong door to pick up his siblings, and this young white people who went up the wrong driveway, and the person was shooting them. And both are using as their defense right now, that they were afraid they would be attacked. And that, of course, is a result of a politics of fear that has been propagated in many ways in the last 5 to 7, 8 years in this country that it suddenly becomes a personal thing. Like, I was afraid, and therefore I have a right to protect myself. But that's already the result of a larger politics of fear that gets translated down to a particular neighborhood and to particular people who for the wrong reasons, but who felt probably afraid, you know.
Hmm.
And you need to help you need to help your listeners, or I need to do my work here at the university to kind of lower the temperature on
Hmm.
these issues.
Yeah, I'll give you two issues on that. I'll come back to the second one, which I think your work actually helps on. The first one, in terms of political reform, I recommend moving to what we call post-partisanism. You know, partisanism is, should we have two parties or eight parties? Post-partisanism is, you can have political parties. You can even have just two political parties. But the question is, what's the structure look like that they run in? So if today the political parties control the primary system, so you only have two parties, and what happens is people have to fit into one of those two boxes if they want to be able to participate. So they either have to participate with the far alt-right or they have to participate with the woke left. And when they get involved in that process, unfortunately, because of the numbers, it literally is, I could prove this to you, it's less than about 6% of the total public, the total possible voting public, that vote in either of those primaries. And they tend to be disproportionately more extreme. When they get done picking a candidate, we have to then select between which one's the worst, right? We look at which one's the lesser of two evils. Well, in a post-partisan system, you can have them all run against one another. You can have 8 people in the primary, but the voters get to vote on all of them. That happens in most of our city elections, right? City elections, it's nonpartisan in the beginning, and when candidates have to run against one another in that environment, they tend to not only look more for middle ground, they tend to avoid extreme positions, but more importantly, they tend to talk more about what are the answers to the problems. But I do think on the second part of this issue, which the question there to me is, how do we resolve it? I think that part of it is you spoke a moment ago about, I don't know how to fix something if we're between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Well, that's because you have two governments, and those two governments now, they're not going to talk to one another. Yet you have found great success in getting people to talk outside of politics, outside of the political system. I think all of us learning how to talk to one another individually, to be able to regain our sense of agency and to understand that we can talk to people that we disagree with, but that it takes a different set of skills. If your goal is to sit down with someone, and again, I can pick someone on the far left or the far right, and my goal is to try to show them why they're wrong, good luck. You're probably not going to accomplish your goal. If my goal is to show them why the facts that they've been using are incorrect, even if the facts they're using are incorrect, good luck. You're not going
Right.
to be able to convince them.
Right.
But if my goal is to try to understand them as a person and to listen to them and to try to empathize with them and to understand where they came from and what they're afraid of and what is their chosen narrative, once I begin to understand them personally, I actually can begin to have an effect on them, because then instead of them hanging on to their ideology, they want to hang on to that relationship. It begins to become valued. Where I think we can make the biggest difference as Americans is quit trying to think that you have to tell people your opinion. And you know, if you want to be patriotic, quit insulting other Americans. Listen to other Americans, engage with other Americans, try to understand where they're coming from. That doesn't mean you're conceding ground. That doesn't mean that you agree with them. It just means that you're respectful and being willing to let them play a role. And I can tell you, I have friends on the far right and the far left that as I've listened to, it's been amazing. It's changed me a little bit. I've understood their point of view better than I did before I came into it, but it also changed them. Anyway, Bjorn,
I
thank you so much for
no,
the work that you're doing.
yeah, you're welcome. I let me add a few thoughts on this one. The New York Times today reported that the American population trust on government has kind of really going down. The trust in the presidency goes down. The trust in the Congress is at 7%. Trust in labor unions is down. Trust in the Supreme Court is going down. So that's really highly problematic. That we as Americans don't trust our own institutions anymore, to the extent that we need to, as we also always have to be critical. But we still fundamentally want to trust them. And so what's happening? We're building up walls right now that seem to be really separating us, where you don't even see the other person on the other side of that wall. And of course, that wall, in my work with Israelis and Palestinians, it's a real wall in Israel that separates the West Bank from Israel mainland. And skeptics always ask me, like, so what? You do this work since 2009. Has the wall come down? I said, no, the wall hasn't come down. This is not what I can do. But what I can do is let people know, with the people I work, is that they can actually live with each other once the wall is down. And once the wall comes down, these are larger political decisions. Then I know there are people who trust each other and who know they can live with each other. And I feel something symbolically similar in this country right now. We don't have a visible wall, but we have this invisible wall separating us. And to start the conversations where if that wall is no longer as strongly as it is right now, that we can live with each other and talk to each other. That is what we need to do. It's a skeptic can always easily point to the failure. The second response is always, well, if we really would have been successful to eradicate all illnesses, we wouldn't need doctors anymore. But for this point, we need doctors. Mm-hmm. The same with peace processes or reconciliation processes. You keep on working on it. We don't say medical establishment fails because people still getting ill and die. No, they are ill and die, and we need the medical establishment, and we need the police force. They didn't fail because there's still crime. There is crime, and we need the police to contain it. And we need the kind of work we do as a containment, not because we can promise a bright utopia that's too high a goal.
The goal is to save lives along the way.
The working together is the important part.
The goal is to save lives along the way. Bjorn, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. Much. I definitely enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll do more in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. And help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned, and we can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.